1.5 million copies, 94% positive reviews in English on Steam, and the skill descriptions were half broken at launch. Welcome to the Black Market, I'm your host Cobalt. And here's what I want to know is, how did this game end up working? I mean, again, the game was barely translated when it launched in the US. It was launched by a developer that was completely unknown in the West at the time. And yet this game was so good that when I saw a game that reminded me of it come out, instead of buying that new game, I immediately went, wait, I should go back and play Warm Snow. So Warm Snow is an action roguelite, and it's kind of in the vein of a Hades-like. And what I really want to know is, how did it end up working so well despite its issues? Or maybe not even despite its issues, but alongside its issues, right? Because this game came out with horrible translation and localization issues, and yet it worked. It sold, and now it has 1.5 to 2 million copies sold. Most games don't have that staying power or that ability to carry that kind of friction and last through that period. If you boot up a game and you can't read it, most people just instantly put it down. Before we get to figuring out why, let's go over what is Warm Snow. You play as Beyond, a lone warrior, 6 flying swords, dark fantasy China, where a plague called the Warm Snow has turned people into monsters, and, you know, the 5 great clans are tangled up in causing it. The story is told through item drops and environmental detail rather than cutscenes, which either lands for you or doesn't. I personally like it because, frankly, I don't need your story in my roguelike, but if you want story, you can find it here. The art direction carries a lot of personality with it, but I think what's doing a lot of work here is the setting. And I want to be clear, not the art, the setting itself. Almost every other action roguelite on Steam at the time, and still to this day, is pulling from Greek mythology, medieval fantasy, or sci-fi. Warm Snow is operating in Wuxia, which is dark fantasy imperial China, flying swords, bosses from old myth. In a browse feed full of games that all look like each other, Warm Snow reads as distinct immediately, especially back when it came out. So for a studio most Western players have never heard of, even with launching with rough localization, looking like nothing else on the Steam page is a real competitive advantage. But that isn't why 1.5 million people bought this. The reason this game works starts with something that sounds really simple, but it's actually really hard to execute, it seems. Or at least it's executed this well rarely. The combat is fast and responsive. One might even call it crisp. And it's not fast in the way that a lot of action roguelikes describe themselves as fast. It's fast in the way where your inputs land immediately. There's no gap between what you decide you're going to do and what actually happens on the screen. And that responsiveness isn't a given with most roguelikes. A lot of studios aim for it and land somewhere near it, but Warm Snow hits the nail on the head. When you die, you know why. And I know I say this a lot, but I think that's really important. There are a lot of games that you play and you die, and it's frustrating because you did your best and there wasn't really an obvious reason that you got killed. But in Warm Snow, the game's not even hiding the reason behind it. You moved wrong. You moved wrong, or you threw your swords at the wrong moment, or you didn't recall your swords at the right moment. You took a hit you should have seen coming. And that clarity of failure is what keeps players hitting retry instead of closing the application, right? Because I know when I die in Warm Snow, I go, man, I could have beat that boss if I just dodged the other way, or maybe I needed to build a little bit more movement speed into my build. So instead of getting frustrated and walking away, I find myself hitting one more run because I know exactly what I need to do to be successful this time. And roguelikes kind of live or die on whether death in them feels instructive or arbitrary, and Warm Snow consistently lands on the right side of that line. So you have 6 flying swords and you throw them, position them, recall them, and the recall pulls every blade back through anything in his path. The reason that mechanic feels good is it's not the design of it, it's that the whole game is running at a speed where reading that split-second window actually feels satisfying rather than chaotic. The positioning is extremely important, but the game feels snappy enough that you can make sure you're in the right position. You slow the game down, the same system becomes a puzzle and less about instinct. At the pace Warm Snow runs at, it runs fully on instinct. at least for the first few hours of the game. Warm Snow hands you 6 independent blades and asks you to make them feel like one thing. The cohesion is where the hours go. You stop throwing your swords and you start placing them. And that shift usually happens around hour 2 without the game ever telling you it happened. I'm no longer just blasting my swords out, I'm making sure I know where they landed and making sure I know where I am when I recall them to deal maximum damage. The build variety is also impeccable in this game. There's multiple schools of swordsmanship, I believe somewhere around 11 or 12, and each school has 2 distinct variations, with the same foundation but a different identity. One school usually rewards aggressive close range play, with swords orbiting you like a weapon, and the other is built for range positioning, throwing your swords as the primary source of damage and recalling as the finisher. 2 players can put 30 hours in and each barely overlap in what they experience. Neither of them had to read the wiki to get there either, and I think that is a huge part about this game, is the barrier to entry is low. Most roguelikes with this level of variety, figuring it out is like reading a dissertation. You have to study it to really understand it. But Warm Snow lets you learn by doing. The schools are each approachable enough that you can pick one because it sounds cool and figure it out through playing it, which is the right order for that kind of system. It also doubles down on how responsive the combat is. Both systems allow you to approach them in a way where you need to know nothing. You can simply function on instinct and try to survive, and that will get you far enough into the game for you to really see what it has to offer. And this all connects to the localization issue. At launch, certain power-up descriptions were unclear. Players were experimenting to figure out what abilities did rather than reading what they said. That's normally a huge retention killer for a game. If you can't understand your build, you can't make decisions, and if you can't make decisions, the run feels out of your control. Whereas in Warm Snow, it survived because understanding your build deeply is optional for a large portion of the game. Obviously, once you hit endgame and are pushing difficulty levels, yes, you need to know exactly what you're doing. But beginning the game, you can function purely on your reaction speed and understanding where you want to be and where you don't want to be. The combat feel carries you. You can run full sessions without min-maxing or knowing exactly what each upgrade chain does. The game is enjoyable before it's legible, and in a genre where most titles put the systems between you and the fun, that's genuinely refreshing, right? You don't have to fully understand how it works to enjoy hours of this game. Now, here's something that almost never gets discussed when people break down why this game succeeded commercially, but the demo was extremely important for this game. Warm Snow launched with a free playable demo, and that decision was extremely significant when it comes to everything that followed, because this is a game from a studio most Western players had never heard of, had massive localization issues, and you could even see the localization issues in the Steam storefront screenshots. It wasn't hiding that, but the demo removed the only thing really standing between a curious player and the purchase. It removed all the risk. You could feel the combat before committing to the purchase. And yes, I understand a lot of people are rolling their eyes and saying, Cobalt, that's how demos work. The whole thing about this game is the combat was the argument for buying the game. The feel of the game superseded the systems placed in the game around that feeling. The demo became even more important, especially when players were looking at a game that they couldn't understand because it was in a different language. You could play the game and feel it and have fun there without needing to understand anything. There's no way to tell someone that that is the case. Only way is for them to experience it themselves in a free demo or by just buying the game. But that free demo took that risk away from people, and they bought it despite its issues. Don't get me wrong now, everything's translated, and the localization is much better. There's still probably some issues. I haven't dived too deep into it in my recent return to playing it, but it's much better than it was. But what actually pushed this game to 1.5 million copies? A setting that stood out in a genre full of identical aesthetics. Combat fast enough to feel instinctive and honest enough that death always teaches you something instead of simply frustrating you. Build variety that gives 2 players completely different games without either of them needing to do homework or figure everything out first. And systems that reward you before they explain themselves. Finally, a demo that let the game make its own case. And I think especially with how this game works and how it feels, without the demo, it wouldn't have been nearly as successful. But underneath everything, it's the speed. Take away that, and none of the rest lands in the same way. Games that fail are not always the ones with bad systems. Sometimes they're the ones with fine systems running at the wrong tempo. Warm Snow got the tempo right first, and built everything else on top of it. If you made it this far in the video, a like and a sub would be very much so appreciated. I'm trying to grow the channel right now, and every little bit helps. Be sure to hit that notification bell so you don't miss my next upload. I stream on Wednesdays, Thursdays, Fridays, and Saturdays, so feel free to stop by and say hi. And as always, guys, I'll be back later in another video. Peace out. And a special thanks to all our members for supporting the channel. You guys are what allows me to keep making these videos and doing what I love, so thank you.